In a small village, a cat named Whiskers discovered a magic fish in a pond. The fish promised 3 wishes in exchange for its freedom. Whiskers wished for endless fish, a cozy bed, and a bell that rang softly. The fish granted all 3 wishes and swam away, leaving Whiskers content and purring in the sun. I'm so glad you're here. Stay with me until the end and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story travels. My son stood in the kitchen doorway, his arms crossed like he was holding the house up with his elbows, and asked it like he was puzzled, maybe even a little embarrassed by me. Why are you still here? Not, how are you still here? Not, can I help you pack? Just that flat, blank question that landed like a paperweight on my chest. I remember blinking at him. I had a dish rag in my hands. I'd just scrubbed his baby's bottles the way I used to. Do for him. Hadn't even dried my hands. That was the first crack I let myself hear. He said it wasn't meant to sound cruel, that he was just tired, that I had taken his words the wrong way. But the words had already echoed, and they didn't fade. They rattled down the hall into the walls of the house I had helped him buy. The one I'd partially paid the down payment on, the one they all pretended I had just moved into instead. I've helped build from the roots up. The same walls where I used to pin up drawings of him in crayon. Lopsided dinosaurs with too many teeth and hearts that said to Mom. Now there were schedules on the fridge, daycare pickups, grocery rotations. My name next to quiet rest in faint pencil. It was only later, when the rooms grew quieter, that I let myself ask it back. Why was I still here? I was 32 when I had him. A late mother, they said. A cautious one. I used to watch him sleep in his crib like he was a fragile lamp made of breath. I skipped vacations, skipped new shoes, saved when I should have. I packed lunches into the same red lunchbox until it cracked at the corners. I didn't throw it away. I cleaned it with vinegar and tape and kept using it. That's who I was. Resourceful. Soft in places only motherhood can carve. He was a gentle boy then. He'd crawl into my lap even when his legs dangled past my knees. He used to trace the lines on my palms and ask why the hands that held him looked tired. And I'd tell him they were strong because of him. That's the memory I keep tucked in the folds of my old wallet like a pressed flower. That still holds its shape but not its scent. But I suppose love, when too long unreciprocated, becomes invisible. I noticed it slowly. The first few months after I moved in, or rather, after I was told it would be temporary while I healed from a hip surgery, they were sweet. My daughter-in-law poured me tea in the mornings. My son called me Mama again. I told myself this was how families mended their seams. But then the warmth began to skip. I'd walk into a room and voices would pause just for a beat too long. She started brewing tea for herself, but not me. He started asking if I needed more naps, more silence. It was never said outright. That's the thing about these betrayals. They're quiet, polite. But I could feel myself being rearranged into the background, like I was a piece of furniture that no longer matched their taste. But no one had figured out how to move me without making a scene. One afternoon, while they were out, I went to dust the bookshelves. I'm not nosy, not any more than any mother, trying to feel a place still belongs to her. That's when I saw the binder. It wasn't hidden, just tucked under some tax files a little too carefully. Inside were printouts, emails with a realtor, messages with a lawyer, even photos of a staged guest bedroom that looked a lot like the one I was sleeping in. Its captions were sharp. Potential for conversion. May require clearing. I sat on the floor with that binder on my knees and felt the house tilt. I wasn't being eased into independence. I was being moved out of the way. I took a breath. It's the kind you take when grief hasn't fully landed yet, but you know it's circling. And then I stood up. And I listened more carefully after that. They spoke softly around me, but not softly enough. She called me a liability one night. He said I wasn't as sharp anymore. I walked past the bathroom mirror and didn't recognize the woman in it. I started pulling out my old folders. The deed copy from the lake house I sold to help him. The joint account records. A notarized letter from when I named him financial proxy during the surgery. I still had strength, hadn't been erased, just silenced. So I began speaking. Again, not loudly, but clearly. I made an appointment with my own lawyer. Asked him to walk me through the paperwork I'd once signed with love, but now reread with clarity. When I gently asked my son about what I'd found, said I was mistaken, confused, overwhelmed. He said I was imagining things, that I was tired. They only wanted what was best for me. And I smiled. The way women smile when they've already packed a bag in their mind, that was the turning point. The quiet place where strength starts humming again. So I did what needed doing, with grace, with time, with proof. The day I signed the transfer, on the condo I secretly bought, he was still asleep upstairs. I left a note on the kitchen table, folded it between the pages of the red lunchbox I'd kept all these years. I asked him the same question he once asked me. Why are you still here? At closing, the real estate agent asked if I wanted help forwarding any mail. I told her no, it's nothing I need from there anymore. I used to believe that a mother's love was a kind of insurance that if you poured enough of yourself into the early years, if you bent where they needed space and softened where they needed comfort, it would come back later, not as repayment, but as respect. When I think of the beginning, I think of our small apartment in the city, 2 floors above a bakery that always smelled like burnt sugar. My son was colicky and never slept through the night, and my body ached from a delivery that left stitches and scars. Still, I would rock him hour after hour, singing songs I barely remembered from my own childhood. He'd fall asleep on my chest, his breath warm and fast against my collarbone. And I'd cry sometimes from exhaustion, yes, but also from something deeper, a kind of awe. He was mine not to own, but to carry, to raise, to love. I didn't have much, no savings too. Speak of no husband by the time he turned 5. But I had a job at the school library, and I had a strong back. I worked mornings, cleaned houses in the afternoons, sometimes sat with elderly neighbors at night just to stretch the budget far enough for rent and a few extras. Second-hand soccer cleats. Birthday cakes that didn't come from a box. Books. He would devour in one sitting. When he was 9, he told me he wanted to be an architect. Said it while kneeling on the living room floor, surrounded by Lebios and rulers and cut-up cereal boxes taped into imaginary skylines. I remember thinking how beautiful that was that he wanted to build things. So I started saving quietly. $5 here, $10 there, in an envelope beneath the towels in my linen closet. That envelope grew over the years, folded and refolded so many times the corners went soft. It was meant for college, or dorms and textbooks and maybe even train tickets to visit when he didn't have time to come home. I never used it for myself. Not even when the water heater broke. Not when I needed new glasses. Not when I chipped a tooth and the dentist said cash only. I told myself those things could wait. That my boy's future COULDN, single quotes T, he got into a good school. He didn't thank me, not exactly. But he hugged me before he left and told me I'd always have a room wherever he lived. I believed him. When he met her, the woman who would become my daughter-in-law, I was genuinely happy. She was polite, careful with her words, always smiling. At the time, I thought that meant kindness. I mistook stillness for warmth. She called me Ma in a tone that didn't feel quite natural, but I brushed that off. Odd. Not everyone is affectionate in the same way. They married in a small ceremony at the courthouse. I paid for the dress she picked, a pale champagne color that looked expensive even though it came from a clearance rack. I paid for the cake too, one of those tiered ones from a local baker with real flowers on top. I wanted it to feel special. She told me I didn't have to. I did it anyway. After the birth of their daughter, my granddaughter, they called late one night. I was recovering from a fall at the time, bruised hip, sore arm. They said it would be easier for everyone if I came to stay with them for a while, just until I was back on my feet. They said there was plenty of room in the guest room, that it would help them too, with the baby, with work. They said it was softness in their voices, but I knew it was a request wrapped as a favor. I said yes, of course, 'cause mothers say yes. The first week was sweet. The baby would gurgle and stretch her fingers toward me, and I'd hold her while her mother napped or showered. I found myself humming again, old lullabies, half-forgotten tunes. My son would pat my shoulder and call me a lifesaver. I believed, briefly, that I was needed, that I was home. But then little things began to change. The guest room started to feel less like a welcome space and more like an assigned corner. They removed the little side table to make room for a crib they never used. My books were boxed without asking, replaced by bins of baby clothes and seasonal decor. One morning, I came downstairs and found my teacup had been moved. Not just shifted, but placed out of reach. They said they were reorganizing, she said. It would be better if we each had our own cupboard now, more efficient. I nodded. I didn't want to seem ungrateful, but I was beginning to feel like a ghost in my own story. My son worked more and more. I'd hear the garage door open late at night and wait for his footsteps. They never came. When I tried to talk to him, he'd glance at his phone, fingers twitching for an escape. I stopped trying. My daughter-in-law, once sweet and sugar-voiced, now spoke to me like I was a piece of mail left in the rain. Damp, a little inconvenient. She'd sigh when I asked questions. I'd smile without looking at me. One afternoon, she suggested I start keeping a journal, said it would help with my memory, that writing things down might ease my confusion. But I wasn't confused, was noticing. I watched as they invited friends for dinner and never asked. If I wanted to join, watch the way my granddaughter was taught to wave at me from afar but not run into my arms. I watched as the pencil on the fridge schedule grew fainter and fainter until the line next to my name disappeared altogether. There is a particular loneliness that settles in when you are surrounded by family who no longer sees you. It doesn't arrive all at once. It drips like a faucet that no one bothers to fix. It fills the silence. And I began to understand something I hadn't let myself admit. I was no longer living in my son's house. I was occupying a waiting room, and someone else was holding the clipboard. The day I discovered it, I wasn't looking for anything. It's just trying to be useful. The baby had dropped a rattle behind the sofa. I knelt to reach for it slowly, carefully, the way my knees now require, and as I stood back up, I noticed the corner of a folder sticking out from beneath a cushion. One of those leather-bound ones you get from banks or real estate offices. It looked important, which meant I probably shouldn't touch it. But something about it felt too deliberate. Like it had been left just out of sight, not by accident, but by carelessness. I opened it with hesitant fingers. The first page had my name. It wasn't handwritten in a letter or printed in a holiday card. It was typed, bold, legal. I read the heading 3 times before I understood. Request for medical evaluation in support of limited conservatorship. I sat down, the rattle still clutched in my other hand. The words swam for a moment, the kind of cruel tide only paperwork can summon. Legal phrases peppered the paragraph. Diminished capacity, monitoring financial activity, intervention in household management. I wasn't being helped. That night I waited until they went upstairs. I could hear the soft hum of the baby monitor through the wall. Her voice, my daughter-in-law's, drifted faintly. She was talking about me, not in anger, in pity. She said I was slipping, that I left the stove on once, which wasn't true, that I forgot names, that I looked lost sometimes. She said it was sad, but inevitable. He didn't argue. He just said, "We'll do what's necessary." I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the space beneath the door, the thin sliver of hallway light stretching across the floor like a blade. That's what I had become necessary to manage. I wanted to scream, but instead I pulled out the binder I'd kept at the bottom of my suitcase. My records, my copies, my name where it still belonged. Birth certificates, the sale agreement for the house I gave up to fund his, the receipts from the dental bills I paid for them last winter. I didn't keep them because I thought I'd need to prove anything. Kept them because I was a mother. And mothers save things. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay still, listening to the creaks of a house that no longer felt like it had corners for me. The next morning, I asked casually about the mail. She said they'd been managing it for me, that there was nothing to worry about. But her voice wavered just a little. And I knew after they left for work, I waited until the mailbox was empty, then called the postal office and requested a hold on any mail addressed to my name. Then I walked to the nearby print shop and asked them to scan a few documents for me, just in case. It felt strange, like being both the detective and the victim in the same story. Over the next week, I looked more closely. The Wi-Fi password had been changed, and I wasn't given the new one. Her laptop, once left on the counter, now went into their bedroom every night. My name had been removed from the utilities. I saw the online bill as she scrolled too fast at the kitchen table. She didn't know I saw. One evening, when I reached to help clear the dishes, she took the plate from my hand and said gently that I should rest more, that it was important not to overdo things at my age. I nodded because that's what she expected. But my hands trembled. I began to write things down, not in the journal she gave me. That one stayed empty. I bought my own, hidden inside the lining of my purse. I wrote down dates, conversations, things I overheard. Bank names, she mentioned. Appointments they didn't tell me about. The pieces came together like frost on a window, slow, silent, then suddenly visible all at once. They weren't planning to move me out. They were planning to keep me still, to paint me as someone incapable, to claim guardianship over my finances, to make it all look legal, kind, even. So no one would ask questions. But I had questions, and I still had answers, so I called a number I hadn't used in a long time. Ruth, an old friend from my book club who had once helped her sister through something similar. She listened to me quietly, then said what no one else had in months. She said, "You're not crazy. You're being cornered." Ruth gave me a number for a lawyer who handled elder rights. I called that same day. I sat in my parked car in the grocery store lot, pretending to be on a call about recipes, while I told a stranger about the way my name had started disappearing from the world around me. He didn't interrupt. He asked clear questions. He told me which documents to bring, which forms to retrieve copies of, and how to request access to the household accounts I had once helped build. That was the day I started my quiet return. At dinner that evening, I smiled when my son asked how I was. Feeling, I said I was sleeping better, that maybe it was time to consider moving on, giving them back their space. They both lit up at that, too quickly, and that told me more than I needed to know. But I wasn't going anywhere just yet, not until I had it all in place. Not until I was seen, so I let them believe what they wanted. That I was fading, that I was softening, but I was sharpening, not out of anger, but out of necessity. They wanted to erase me gently. I would rewrite myself, one signature at a time. It's strange how strength can grow quietly. It's like moss on the side of a stone. You don't notice it until your fingertips brush it. And then you realize it's been there a while, waiting. After that call with the lawyer, something shifted inside me. I didn't cry, not yet. I didn't shout or shake or ask them why. I already knew. What I did instead was begin to move differently in that house, not like a guest, not like a burden, but like someone who remembered her name. I found the envelope with the deed to the cottage I had once owned near the coast, the one I sold to give them the money they needed for the down payment on this home. I hadn't told anyone I kept a notarized receipt of the wire transfer, but I had, folded between 2 pages of a yellowing photo album. I pulled it out one morning while they were upstairs with the baby, and I ran my finger along the ink. I had signed it with love, and they had received it with gratitude. And now it was just history. But it was still mine. Ruth drove me to the lawyer's office the following Tuesday. I wore the burgundy coat I used to save for church. Not for vanity, for certainty. Sometimes you need fabric to feel like armor. The office smelled like old wood and peppermint. The lawyer, Mr. Hanley, greeted me with soft hands and a voice that didn't talk down. He didn't use words like sweetheart or dear. He called me Mrs. Halbridge, and he looked me in the eye when he spoke. We sat across from each other at a glass table. I laid out every paper I had: tax records, proof of financial contribution, old emails about account access, even a copy of the signed medical directive they'd used to make it look like I was declining. He looked over each page carefully, nodding, underlining, and finally, leaning back with a low exhale, he said something that I carry with me now, like a lighthouse. "Beam, they were hoping you'd stay quiet." I asked him what I should do. He smiled gently and said, "You've already started." The next few weeks were quiet, but not idle. I requested a copy of my credit report. I ordered a full bank history. I began forwarding my mail to a P.O. box. Ruth helped me rent under her name. Each piece of paper I opened felt like reclaiming a little more breath. I wasn't paranoid, was precise. I kept everything tucked in a small accordion folder I slid beneath my bed at night. And I slept better knowing it was there, not because of what it could do to them, but because of what it meant for me. That I still had a voice, that I hadn't been erased. There was one morning that almost broke me. I was making toast and my son walked into the kitchen, half awake, phone in hand. He didn't look up, just mumbled that I should maybe rest more, that I seemed tired lately. I asked him softly what made him think that. He didn't answer. Just sipped his coffee and said the word concern, like it was something charitable. Like it was a gift. That was the moment I knew I would never be safe in this house again. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the narrative they were building around me. One I had no voice in. It's a portrait of a woman too fragile to manage her own life. And if I didn't act, if I didn't move before their version became the only one people believed, I'd lose more than just a room. I'd lose myself, so I started calling things by their name. Not out loud, not yet, but in my heart. This wasn't protection. This was control. This wasn't care. This was manipulation. And I wasn't a guest. I was a placeholder. They were trying to retire. That week, I met privately with a financial advisor Mr. Hanley recommended. A woman named Layla, kind-eyed but sharp. She went through my account access with a fine-tooth comb. She showed me what had been changed, which authorizations had been added, which email addresses didn't belong to me. There were things I hadn't noticed, small withdrawals, password changes. An online account opened in my name with their address. As the recovery, nothing massive, just enough to prepare for a slow transfer of control. Layla looked at me after a long pause and asked if I wanted to press charges. I shook my head. This wasn't about punishment. It was about reclamation. I didn't want to ruin their lives. I just wanted mine back, so we made a plan. Quiet, legal, absolute. I removed their access to my funds. I changed the names on my health directive. I updated my will. And I made sure that every step was documented, time-stamped, traceable. They would have no say over what wasn't theirs. Not anymore. One afternoon while they were out shopping, I printed a letter. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even angry. It simply said, "This is my life. I am not confused. I am not broken. I am not yours to manage." I sealed it in an envelope and placed it under the vase on the kitchen counter, the one I'd given them as a housewarming gift. Long before I understood what warmth really required, then I sat on the back porch, watching the wind play with the swing that no one used anymore. I held a cup of tea in both hands, let it warm the bones in my fingers, and closed my eyes. For the first time in months, felt stillness without fear. They came home later that evening, cheerful, noisy, arms full of shopping bags. My son walked past me without looking. My daughter-in-law asked if I'd remembered to put the mail out. I just smiled because I had remembered everything. The day I confronted them. The house was quiet. It wasn't planned. I hadn't circled a date on the calendar or rehearsed a speech in the mirror. It just rose up in me, slow and certain, like water finding its level. Some truths are like that. They don't crash through the door. They seep in through the cracks until you realize the room is already flooded. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the morning light falling soft across the linoleum, a pot of tea steeped beside me. I had laid out 3 mugs, one for each of us. I remember thinking how strange it was to still do things like that, out of habit. Out of hope, they came downstairs together. My daughter-in-law was scrolling through her phone. My son was rubbing sleep from his eyes. The baby monitor still clipped to his belt. I asked if we could talk for a minute. She glanced up with that smile, the one that always felt like it belonged to someone standing behind me. He pulled out a chair with a sigh, already restless. I said I had noticed a few things, that the mail hadn't been coming directly to me, that there had been paperwork with my name on it, decisions being made about me, not with me. I kept my voice steady. I didn't raise it. I didn't accuse. I didn't say you did this. I said I found this. I said I've been looking into some things. I said I've made some changes. At first, they both just blinked. 'Twas almost theatrical, the silence that followed. Then she tilted her head and said she was concerned, that I'd been confused lately, that perhaps I had misunderstood what I saw. I looked at her for a long time. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I pulled out the folder, not the big one. Not all the documents, just a few select pages. The letter I'd written, the bank notice, copy of the conservatorship form I'd found beneath the sofa cushion. I slid them across the table gently. Like laying down a hand of cards, my son leaned forward and began to speak, his voice low and to calm, like he was explaining something to a child who wouldn't stop crying. He said I'd been under a lot of stress, that maybe I was reading too much into things, that of course they cared for me, that everything they'd done was to protect me. That word again, protect. I told him I didn't need protection. I needed honesty. I needed the truth, even if it hurt. I said I could forgive almost anything but erasure. He opened his mouth and closed it, and that's when it happened. The moment the mask slipped, she reached across the table and gathered the papers like they were junk mail. She smiled too brightly and said she didn't think this conversation was necessary, that perhaps I should lie down, rest, think things through before making such dramatic assumptions. Dramatic? It landed like a slap. Not because of the word, but because it was so casual, so practiced. I stood up slowly. My hands didn't shake. I told them I wouldn't be staying much longer. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, the air thick with the quiet tension that comes after a mask breaks, but the performance must continue. They didn't come to apologize. They didn't knock. The only sound was the soft whir of the baby monitor and the distant hum of the television downstairs. I didn't cry. I'd already cried the day I found the folder. This was different. Was confirmation. In the days that followed, things were cool, polite. They didn't bring it up again. They didn't ask what I'd done or who I'd called. They moved around me like I was a piece of furniture they didn't know how to return. She started whispering again when I walked past. He stopped calling me Mama. I packed slowly. Not my things, not yet, but my trust, my expectations, my loyalty. I folded them into smaller pieces and placed them somewhere deeper inside me. I made more calls, spoke to Layla, spoke to Mr. Hanley, arranged a quiet exit that would not depend on their approval. Every day I sipped tea at the same kitchen table. And every day they pretended we hadn't had that conversation. It was a kind of denial I couldn't have imagined before. It was never about caring for me. It was about controlling the version of me that they found most convenient. A woman who didn't ask questions. A woman who didn't keep copies. A woman who didn't know her worth. But I did. I always had. Had just been waiting for the moment when remembering it became necessary. One morning she asked me to sign something. Just a small form, she said, something about the car insurance. I asked her to leave it on the counter. I said I'd review it later. She didn't. She threw it away. And that told me more than anything else could. I was no longer a person in their home. I was a potential risk in their plan. And now they knew I had woken up. They thought love meant silence. They thought history meant obedience. But I had learned. The same way a wound learns to scar. The next day, I called Ruth and told her it was time. The morning I left for the meeting with Mr. Hanley and Layla. I made the bed as if I were still coming back. I smoothed the quilt my own mother stitched when I was newly married. Pressed my hand over the fold in the pillow. Picked up the mug on the nightstand and rinsed it slowly, carefully. As if nothing were shifting underneath my feet. It's a strange thing how the body clings to routine even as the heart prepares. For departure, I didn't say goodbye. I told them I had a doctor's appointment, that I'd be gone most of the afternoon. She didn't ask what for. He didn't look up from his phone. That told me everything I needed to know about the kind of care they were offering. Ruth was already waiting in the driveway. She had a scarf tied at her neck, the way she always did when she felt serious. She smiled when she saw me, not the kind of smile that says this will be easy, but the kind that says you are not alone. We drove in silence for the first few miles. The radio played softly, something instrumental, the kind of music that doesn't demand attention but fills the space. Between thoughts, I looked out the window at the summer trees bending in the breeze and thought about how many years I'd been bending like that. Quietly adjusting myself around other people's comfort. Shrinking in places where I used to stand tall. We arrived at Mr. Hanley's office just after 10. He was already there with Layla, papers spread neatly across the conference table. They stood when I entered, both of them rising with something that felt like respect, not obligation. He gestured for me to sit. I remember smoothing my skirt as I did, anchoring myself with that small, familiar motion. Layla began first. She walked me through the protections we'd put in place over the last few weeks. My assets had been fully transferred into a private trust in my name only. The power of attorney that once allowed my son to make financial decisions on my behalf had been legally revoked. New bank accounts, updated healthcare proxy. A will that reflected my voice and no one else's. I'd taken myself back page by page. Mr. Hanley handed me a folder with every document inside organized. Labeled witnessed. Then came the question, are you ready to move forward with your formal statement? I nodded. I'd written it myself the night before, sitting by the window with just a lamp and a cup of tea. It wasn't angry, wasn't vindictive, was clear, direct, and true. I stated the timeline when I moved in, how decisions were made without my knowledge, how mail was withheld, how attempts were made to portray me as incapable. I described the emotional coercion without embellishment. I backed it with facts, emails, bank records zip form with their handwriting still visible in the margins. Mr. Hanley filed the paperwork that same day. It wasn't to punish them. It was to protect me. Because the truth is, manipulation wrapped in politeness is still manipulation. And control spoken in soft voices still steals freedom. On the way home, Ruth asked how I was feeling. I told her the truth. I felt like I had been holding my breath for months, and now I could finally exhale, even if it came with a sting. She reached over and gave my hand a gentle squeeze. No words, just presence. That night, I didn't eat dinner with them. I said I wasn't feeling well and stayed in my room. But I wasn't sick. I was preparing, quietly gathering the last things that still belonged to me. A silver locket. The envelope of saved birthday cards from when my son still signed his name. With hearts, the worn quilt from the bed, I left most everything else. Not out of defeat, but because those things no longer held me. They were props in a life I no longer wished to play along with. Ruth came the next morning. We loaded the car together, slowly, deliberately. There wasn't much to suitcases. A box of important documents. And a grocery bag filled with little keepsakes that reminded me who I used to be. I didn't leave a note. I didn't slam any doors. I walked out through the front entrance like I had every right to. 'Cause I did. My son came downstairs as we were walking out. His voice was tight, Surprised, maybe, but not panicked. He asked what I was doing, where I was going. I told him I'd remembered who I was. That was all. He looked at Ruth, then at the bags, then at me. And in his eyes I saw it, not regret, not sorrow. It's just calculation, like a man realizing the chessboard had shifted while he was looking away. He didn't try to stop me, not once. And that told me more than if he had. Begged. Ruth drove me to a short-term rental just outside of town, a little place I'd found online with a porch swing and hydrangeas blooming wild along the fence. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. That first night, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the trees. And I thought about all the ways people disappear long before they're gone. How silence can become a prison. How kindness, when twisted, can turn into a leash. But I was free now, not just from their control, but from the story they were trying to write me into. I poured myself a glass of water. I turned on the radio. I sat with myself, not waiting for the next hurt, but listening to the quiet like it was music. I had taken the long road back to myself, and for the first time in a very long time, I was home. Freedom, I've learned, doesn't always arrive with a trumpet. Sometimes it's just the sound of your own breath in a room no one else controls. The hum of your own thoughts uninterrupted. In that little rental house, I moved slower, not from age, but from intention. I lit candles in the evening, not because I needed the light, but because I liked the way the flame danced against the walls. I drank tea from a ceramic mug I picked out myself. No one else had ever touched it. And somehow that mattered. The quiet no longer frightened me. It became a kind of companionship. I had spent so long surrounded by people who thought silence meant agreement. But here, silence was my own. It wasn't empty. It was clean. The first week, I didn't tell anyone where I was. Reth knew, of course. She checked in every morning, always with something gentle. A photo of a rose bush blooming in her yard, a recipe she wanted to try, a little joke her grandson had told. She never asked how I was unless I offered it, and slowly I did. I started journaling, not to document evidence, not for strategy, just for me. I wrote about memories that came back in flashes. My son's first lost tooth. It's the time we both laughed until we cried when the grocery bag split open in the parking lot. The way he used to rest his head on my lap during thunderstorms. I let the grief come. Not the grief of leaving the house, but the deeper one. The grief of loving someone who grew into a stranger with your eyes. It's an ache I don't think has a name. It's a kind that builds not from loss, but from the slow unraveling of something you thought was unbreakable, but I didn't let it undo me. I began to stitch something new. Layla called with updates. The trust was secured. The will had been officially amended. Every financial account was locked under new credentials. And most importantly, a legal statement had been issued clarifying that I was of sound mind and had full autonomy. They wouldn't be able to touch a cent. Mr. Hanley added that if they pushed further, if they attempted another petition or tried to interfere, we had enough evidence to counter and protect. He said I'd built a wall, but to me it felt more like a door. Because once you name what has been done to you, once you speak it in a room where people listen, you start to remember who you were before it was done. I found a small antique desk at a secondhand shop not far from the rental. It was chipped in the corners and smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. I cleaned it slowly, wiped every groove, and set it near the window. That desk became a place of becoming. I wrote letters I never sent. I made lists of things I wanted to do, not for practicality, but for joy. I searched online for homes in quieter towns, ones with wide porches and neighbors who waved. Not to run, but to begin again, somewhere that never knew me as a woman shrinking in the corners of her own story. I was no longer waiting to be given space. I was creating it. One afternoon, Ruth brought over lemon scones and 2 little planters, thyme and rosemary. She set them on the windowsill and said something that stayed with me. She said, "You didn't burn the bridge." You just stopped holding it up all by yourself. That night, I stood outside under the stars, barefoot on the grass. I looked up at a sky that didn't know my name and still offered its beauty freely, and I whispered a thank you to the air. Not to a person, not to fate, but to the quiet voice in me that never stopped whispering, not yet, not this. Not you. The voice they had tried to silence with polite concern. The voice that had once been drowned out by casseroles and calendars and quiet corrections about what I remembered. But that voice was loud now, clear, and mine. I didn't want revenge. I wanted release. And I had it, but then 3 weeks after, I left. My son called Dot. It was a short message, just said he wanted to talk. That there had been a misunderstanding. That he missed me. I didn't answer. Not because I was angry, but because I was no longer the woman who rushed to fix everything. Just because someone else had finally noticed she was gone, I played the message twice, and then I deleted it. Because love without accountability is just a memory. And I wasn't going to live in memory anymore. A few days later, a letter arrived. His handwriting on the envelope. Inside, he said they'd been thinking a lot. That maybe things got out of hand. That they never meant to hurt me. That if I wanted to come back not to live, just to visit, the door was open. But here's the thing. It wasn't about the door, it was about the locks. They'd quietly changed while I was still inside, and I had already built a door of my own. I folded the letter gently and placed it in a drawer. Not out of sentiment, but out of truth. That part of my life had been real, the good and the painful, but it was no longer current. It was no longer mine to carry forward. I looked around. The small rental at the lavender candles, the herb planters, the little chipped desk by the window. And I smiled. I wasn't healed yet, but I was healing Dot, and for the first time in a long time. I was moving not because I was pushed, but because I had chosen. The invitation came in the form of a text, a Sunday dinner. Just us, he wrote. Let's clear the air. I stared at the screen for a long time. The same fingers that once curled around his as he learned to walk hovered now, uncertain, over a message that pretended everything could be swept away in one meal. I didn't reply. Not right away. I let the silence sit for 2 days. Then I sent back 2 words. I'll come. Not because I wanted to smooth things over, not because I missed the airless room of that house, but because some stories need to end with the truth spoken. Out loud, not shouted, not thrown, but placed gently on the table where no one can pretend it wasn't said. Ruth offered to drive me. I said no. I needed to walk into that house on my own. I wore the navy coat he once said made me look strong. The one I hadn't worn since before the surgery, before the slow undoing. I pinned my mother's brooch at the collar. I tucked a thin folder under my arm. I arrived at 6. The front door opened before I could knock. He looked tired. Not in the way that comes from work or sleepless nights, but from holding a version of a story that no longer fits. My daughter-in-law stood behind him, smiling with just her lips. Her arms were crossed over her sweater, even though the house was warm. The baby wasn't there. I hadn't asked, but I was quietly relieved. They had set the table. Cloth napkins, candles, 2 glasses of wine already poured. The air smelled like rosemary chicken. Kate, it was the kind of meal you prepare when you want to look generous. But the tension hung between us like steam off a cooling plate. I sat down. We made small talk, or they tried to. They asked how I'd been. I said, well. They asked if I was staying nearby. I said for now. They asked if I was cold. I said not anymore. Finally, he put down his fork, cleared his throat. He said they had been thinking. That maybe they had overstepped. That they had been worried about me and, yes, perhaps gone about things the wrong way. But it had all come from a place of love. Okay. That they wanted things to be good again. That we were a family. I let him finish. Then I reached into my coat and pulled out the folder. I placed it in the center of the table between the salt and the centerpiece. I said calmly, That I had brought a few things with me, not to accuse, but to clarify. Because love without truth is just performance. And I wasn't interested in performance anymore. Inside the folder were copies of every legal update. The revocation of power of attorney, the signed affidavit affirming my cognitive clarity, the financial records showing account changes made without my consent, the withdrawal history, the dated conservatorship form I had found in their house. I didn't read them aloud. I didn't have to. I just opened the folder and let the pages rest there, visible, undeniable. My son stared at them. Then at me. He said nothing. My daughter-in-law leaned forward. Her voice hushed, like this was something that needed to be kept soft. She said they didn't mean for it to go that far, but they were trying to prepare for the future. They thought I would feel more secure if things were structured. I said that structured is not the same as controlled. I said I had not forgotten my name. I said I had not lost my mind. I said I had given them the benefit of the doubt longer than I should have. And now I was giving them the benefit of the truth. And then I looked directly at my son, the boy I had once carried on my hip through rainstorms, the man I had helped stand when he nearly gave up on school, the father I had held in the hospital lobby when his daughter was born. I told him I'd seen the difference between fear and manipulation, that I could forgive mistakes, but I could not live in someone else's version of my decline. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked down at his plate. She stood up abruptly, saying she needed to check on something in the kitchen. I let her go. The conversation wasn't hers. Anymore, the silence between us was thick. But it wasn't the kind that demanded filling. It was the kind that comes when the lie is done breathing. I stood, folded the folder shut, and placed it back under my arm. I said I wouldn't be coming back, that I didn't need to be rescued, that if he ever wanted a relationship again, it would have to be built on something new, not the ruins of manipulation wrapped in good manners. He nodded. Once, it was not an apology. Oh, it was the closest he could offer that didn't require words. At the door, I paused, looked around the house, the photographs on the walls, the faint scuff marks on the floor from the baby's walker. The chair where I once sat to read, now folded in the corner like it was waiting for a better season. Then I said it. Not to wound, but to name the moment. You asked me once why I was still here. I've finally answered that question for myself, and then I left. Not hurriedly, not with drama. Just a woman walking back to herself. The air outside was cool, clean. I didn't cry. I walked 3 blocks before I reached the car I had rented for the evening. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, looking up at the sky. The stars were soft and indifferent. I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I was whole. The next morning, I sat at the small table in my rental's kitchen. Fingers wrapped around a warm mug, steam rising into the soft morning light. Outside, the street was quiet. Just the rustle of trees and the gentle tapping of a bird on the WINDOWSILL. It felt like I had survived a storm no one else saw. There was no applause, no grand announcement, just my breath moving steadily through my body again, unchoked by fear or doubt or obligation. I picked up the notebook I'd started during my first week here, not the one for evidence, but the other one. The one filled with little lists and dreams and reminders that life could still be wide, still be mine, at the top of the newest page. I wrote a single word, begin. That word carried more weight than I expected. It wasn't about escaping anymore. It was about stepping into something entirely new. I made 3 calls that day. The first was to Ruth. I told her I was ready to look at something permanent, a home of my own, small, manageable, sunlit. She clapped through the phone, said she had a friend who might know a place. Promised to drive me to every viewing herself if I let her. The second was to Layla, to let her know I'd need help consolidating some accounts for a down payment. She said she'd already drawn up a few suggestions and had been waiting for me to say the word. There was a joy in her voice I hadn't heard before. The joy of someone watching a woman reassemble herself. Without shame. And the third call. The third was to the RV lot off the highway. I'd seen the flyer months ago, taped to the bulletin board in the grocery store. It's gently used, immaculate interior. Sleeps too. Light blue trim. I didn't want to live on the road. But I wanted to. Know that I could. That I could wake up one morning and say, "Today I want the sea," and drive until it was outside my window. I wanted the kind of freedom that didn't ask for permission. I scheduled a visit for the next day. And just like that, the future began to shift shape, not as a reaction to pain, but as an offering to possibility. That evening, I pulled out. A small box I had kept in the back of my closet held little remnants of a woman I used to be, a thimble from my mother's sewing tin. A photograph of my son on his 10th birthday with cake on his nose. A pressed daisy from a summer-long. Gone. I laid them out gently, not as a farewell, but as a recognition. These pieces had shaped me, but they did not define what came next. I took a deep breath and began packing. Not to run, to choose. The next morning, Ruth drove me to the RV lot, just like she said she would. The sun was soft on the gravel and the rows of vehicles shimmered, like metal giants waiting for their names to be spoken. When I saw it, the light blue trim, the tidy white siding, the small porch light above the door, I felt something flutter in my chest. Not nerves. Hope. The man who sold it to me had kind eyes and a voice like warm bread. He said it had belonged to a widow who drove up the coast every year just to see the fall leaves. He said she named it Meredith, but I could rename it if I wanted. I didn't. I liked that this RV already carried the spirit of a woman who had chosen to keep moving. I paid in full. No loans, no questions. The money had always been there, quietly waiting for me to remember I was allowed to use it. For me, Ruth took a picture of me standing in front of it. One hand on the door handle, the other holding the keys. I didn't smile wide, just a soft curve, enough to say I'm here. That night, I slept in the RV's bed with the windows cracked open. I listened to the crickets, the hum of the small refrigerator, the whisper of wind through the trees. I was alone, but not lonely. The freedom was not loud, was steady, like a river that had always been flowing. I had just stopped paddling against it. I named the feeling rebirth. But not like a phoenix, flaming and dramatic. More like a garden that had been ignored for too long and finally remembered how to bloom. The next morning, made a list. Buy a hanging plant for the rearview mirror, frame the photo Ruth took. Map out a route to the coast. Call the realtor about the cottage listing Ruth mentioned, write a letter. Not to send. Just to let it guy didn't write his name at the top of the page. I didn't need to. He would always be part of my past, but he would not dictate my future. I thought about that final dinner. The way he looked at the papers, at me, at the wreckage of his own plan unraveling. I wondered if he knew then what I had come to understand, that when a mother finally stops protecting the people who hurt her, she becomes something even stronger than before. Not bitter, not hardened, just clear. And clarity is its own kind of power. The sky turned dusky blue as I pulled out of the lot for the first time. Meredith rumbling gently beneath me. I didn't know where I would stop. Didn't need to. I only knew that wherever I went next, I would arrive as myself. No disguise, no apology. No shadows cast by someone else's version of me. Just this woman. Whole, quiet, free. I used to think peace was something given. A room made ready. A voice calling you in. A warm hand offering quiet. But I've come to understand that peace isn't gifted. It's claimed. Something you build, plank by plank, even when your hands are trembling and your knees ache from the years spent kneeling for people who only look down. I found peace not in a ceremony, not in forgiveness handed out like folded napkins at a family table. I found it in the small, uneventful hours after, when there was no one left to perform for. A week after I bought Meredith, I drove to the coast. It wasn't far. Just enough to leave behind the noise of familiar streets and the weight of being seen through someone else's lens. I took the long way, the one that curved through hills and dipped into tree-shadowed valleys. I rolled the windows down and let the wind undo me gently. At a rest stop just before the shoreline, I pulled over and made tea on the little stove. Steam rose and curled into the sunlight, slanting through the window, and I watched it like it was telling me something, that time was no longer something to fear. I drank slowly, holding the cup with both hands. There was no urgency now, no list of tasks to prove my usefulness. No quiet rooms where I was both the ghost and the blamed. No locked drawers. No whispered plans. Only me, and that, I realized, was enough. I stayed in a small coastal park for a few days, parked beneath the sway of pines. The ocean roared softly in the distance, as if whispering, "You were never meant to stay small." Each morning I walked the shoreline, picking up shells with holes worn clean through, fragile things made stronger by the sea. I brought 3 back with me and lined them across the dashboard. I didn't think much about the house, or the room I left behind, or the woman who smiled without warmth and called me confused. I didn't think about my son's face when I laid the truth on the table. Instead, thought about the sound of my own footsteps in the sand, the rhythm of being unaccounted for, the joy of being untethered, and something in me softened, not toward them, not yet, but toward myself. The part of me that had waited too long, that had stayed seated at a table where I was no longer fed, that had swallowed suspicion like medicine and hoped it would cure something it never touched. I forgave her, the woman I had been. I forgave her for needing to be wanted, for mistaking silence for peace, for thinking that love could shield her, from being used that night as the sky turned to ink and the sea hummed its old lullaby. I lit a candle on the RV's tiny counter and sat down with a pen, not to make another list, not to prepare, just to write. I wrote a letter I'll never send Dot to him. I told him I had loved him with everything I had. From the first flutter in my belly to the last day I stood in his doorway. I told him I had carried him not just in my arms, but in every decision, every sleepless night, every sacrifice no one noticed. I told him I understood now that love, when not returned with respect, becomes a kind of self-harm. And I told him I was done hurting myself. I didn't blame him for everything. He came for me, yes, but not only from me. The world shapes men with unspoken permissions. Sometimes they don't even know they're asking for power. They just take it because it's been laid out like a rug at their feet. But I also told him this: it is never too late to take off the crown you weren't meant to wear. It is never too late to look your mother in the eye and say, "Sorry I let you disappear." I folded the letter and tucked it into the pocket of an old coat. One day I may throw it away, but not yet. Some truths take time to dissolve. Before I left the coast, I did one more thing. I found a little consignment shop tucked behind a weather-beaten cafe. I wandered through the narrow aisles, salt-stained. Books, chipped pottery, scarves that smelled faintly of lavender and tide. In the back, I found a glass frame, delicate but whole, the kind that looks like it's meant to protect something fragile. I bought it that afternoon. I took the photo Ruth had snapped me standing beside Meredith's, hand on the door, brooch shining at my collar, and placed it inside. Sat perfectly beneath the glass. A woman, not performing, not begging, not fading, just becoming. I hung it near the bed in the RV, where the morning sun would touch it first. A new altar, not to what I had lost, but to what I had returned to Dot myself. I didn't plan to return to the city. But sometimes life circles back just enough to show you how far you've come. 3 weeks after my trip to the coast, I got a call from Ruth. Her voice was soft, but her words landed like a pebble dropped into still water. He had called her, my son, said he was worried, said he hadn't heard from me, asked if she thought I was. I thanked her for telling me. I didn't ask for his number, didn't need to. I sat with the news for a while, the way someone might sit with an old coat in their lap, familiar, but no longer worn. He missed me, perhaps. But missing someone is not the same as seeing them. Still, something stirred. Not obligation, not even curiosity, just a quiet readiness to witness what might be. Now that everything had changed, I made tea and walked through a nearby park. The leaves were beginning to shift, not in a rush, but gently, like they'd agreed among themselves it was time to let go. I admired that kind of grace, not dramatic, not defiant. Just a soft surrender to the season. I sat on a bench facing the water, pulled out my little notebook and wrote down a single sentence. What would it look like to meet without expectation? I let it sit there uncrossed, unanswered. Later that evening, I opened the drawer where I had kept the letter, the one I'd written but never sent. I reread it slowly, quietly, breathing through each word like a woman walking through the rooms of a home she no longer lives in. Then I tucked it back into the coat pocket, zipped it shut, and placed it in the back of the closet. Not because I needed to forget, but because I had remembered enough. The next morning, I wrote him a note. Not a letter, just a few lines. I heard you asked about me. I'm well. Hope you are too. If we ever meet again, it will be as two adults, not as mother and son frozen in old roles. You are welcome to reach out when you're ready. If not, I'll still be here, living quietly and fully. Take care. I didn't sign it, love. I didn't need to. I mailed it without a return address. Not to punish him, but to give both of us room. Room for reflection. Room for dignity. Room for choice. That act, the quiet mailing of a boundary, handwritten and unadorned, felt like a ceremony. My fingers trembled slightly as I slipped it into the blue box, not with fear, with release. Afterward, I walked to the small hardware store near the rental. I bought a tiny brass plaque. Nothing fancy, just a smooth rectangle with space for 3 short lines. Back at the RV, I screwed it gently into the inside of the cabinet above the stove. Her life, her rhythm, her return. It wasn't a manifesto, just a reminder, marker of where I'd come back to. The next few days passed like soft river water. I read more, baked small things, muffins, biscuits, a simple apple tart that Ruth said tasted like memory without the sadness. I started sketching again, poorly but joyfully. Little images of places I'd parked, faces I'd seen, the outline of a single bird overhead. I thought often about where to go next. The mountains were calling in their quiet way. And there was a lake Ruth once mentioned up past the ridge, where the air was said to be so still in the morning you could hear your own heartbeat. But I wasn't in a rush. The beautiful thing about freedom is that it doesn't push. It waits patiently until you feel like moving again. One evening, I sat by the RV window as dusk crept across the land. I had turned off the overhead light, and the glow from the candle on the counter painted shadows across the walls. Outside, the world was hushed. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once. Then silence again. I found myself thinking about love, the real kind. Not the one measured in holidays or habit, but the kind that holds you upright when the world tilts. I thought about how many times I had confused duty with devotion, about how often I had dimmed myself so someone else could feel tall. But now, in this soft, new chapter, I had nothing left to prove. No one left to perform for. I was no longer a background figure in someone else's story. I was the author again. And in that moment, watching the sky darken, I made myself a promise. Never again will I remain where I am, only tolerated. Never again will I stay quiet to keep the illusion alive. And never again will I forget my own voice just to preserve someone else's comfort. I whispered it aloud, into the stillness. Not as a declaration, but as a vow. A few days later, I bought a small wind chime from a roadside artisan. It was made of copper and glass, delicate but sturdy. I hung it just outside the RV's main door. Every time it moved in the breeze, it reminded me, you're here, you're whole. You're home, though. Cottage found me before I found it. Ruth had mentioned it weeks ago, a little place outside town just past a grove of sycamores. She said it was nothing special from the road, easy to miss. But once you stepped through the gate, something shifted. She was right. The day we went to see it, a soft rain had just passed. The gravel path glistened. The air smelled of soil and something faintly sweet, like old roses. A crooked wooden sign hung above the gate, hand-painted in fading letters. Welcome anyway. That did something to me. The cottage itself sat low against the earth with a sloped roof, ivy curling along the stone foundation, and a porch that wrapped around like an embrace. The windows were large but not showy, with lace curtains tied gently to the side. Inside, it was modest. It's 2 rooms, a fireplace, and a kitchen the size of a postage stamp. The floorboards creaked in places. The wallpaper peeled slightly at the corners. There was a small crack in the ceiling above the bed, not structural, just a line where time had left its signature. I walked through each room slowly, the way you approach something sacred. I ran my hand along the mantel, opened a drawer, touched the cool porcelain sink with reverence. I didn't have to ask the price. I didn't need to think about the paperwork. I only asked the realtor one thing: when can I move in? She smiled, said, "It's already empty. It's waiting for someone who'll fill it with quiet." I signed the next morning, not because I was running out of options, but because I had stopped waiting for permission. It was time to put roots somewhere. Of my choosing, not roots grown out of sacrifice, but roots grown out of return. Ruth helped me move a few essentials from the RV to the cottage. Not everything Meredith would remain mine, always ready to carry me when the road called, but enough to make the space feel like a next chapter rather than a complete departure. The first thing placed in the cottage was the framed photo. Me standing beside Meredith, hand on the door, eyes calm. I put it on the mantel. The second thing was the wind chime, which I hung from the porch beam. Its soft clang followed me like a friend as I unpacked. I didn't rush. I placed things one at a time. A yellow bowl I found in a thrift shop in coastal Maine. A blanket I knitted during a season of deep worry, now folded with peace. My mother's brooch, pinned to a piece of linen, hung near the mirror by the door. Each object had earned its right to stay. I slept on the floor the first night, on a borrowed mattress. Windows opened to the rustle of trees. The moonlight filtered through the leaves and painted soft patterns across the wall. I felt held not by anyone, not by promises, but by the walls themselves. As if the cottage had been waiting for a woman who knew how to carry silence with a grace. In the morning, I made tea and drank it on the porch, wrapped in a sweater that still smelled faintly of sea air. I watched the world wake up. A fox slipping through the brush, a bird tapping twice against the window before flying on. Nothing demanded anything from me. I was here, and that was enough. Over the next week, I did something I hadn't done in years. I planted. Just a few things at first: rosemary, lavender, a stubborn patch of thyme. I wore old gloves, knelt into the earth, and let my hands become part of the story again. It's not the story of someone helping a family flourish. It's not the story of someone erased in the process. Just the story of a woman with a trowel, a patch of dirt, and time. Every morning, I tended to the garden. Every night, I lit a candle and wrote one line in my notebook. Not a summary, not a journal, just a line. A truth I had found that day. The soil is softer than I remember. I'm quieter now, but I am not less. The lavender blooms even when I forget to check on it. I didn't hear from him again. Not a call, not a letter, not a knock at the door, and that was okay. Closure isn't always a reunion. Sometimes it's a door that stays closed, not out of bitterness, but because you finally stopped reaching for the knob. I no longer needed an apology to feel whole. I had spoken my truth, protected my future, and walked into my own life. Some days I still think of the little things. How his voice sounded when he was 5. The smell of the sweater I wrapped him in after a long bath. The way he once held my hand at the county fair and told me he'd never let go. But I've learned not to live there. Memories are visitors, not tenants. They arrive, they sit with you. And then, if you've done the work, they leave gently when you ask them to. One afternoon, I found an old mailbox at a flea market. The red flag was rusted and the hinge squeaked when I opened it. I bought it anyway, Ruth helped me install it at the edge of the gravel drive. We painted it sky blue. I stenciled the number on the side, and beneath it I wrote a word, still it. Meant everything. Still here, still whole, still becoming. That night, I lit a fire in the little hearth and sat with a blanket over my legs, the air fragrant with rosemary and ash. Outside, the wind stirred the chimes. Inside, everything was quiet but not empty. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't lost. I wasn't erased. I was home. It came on a Thursday. I had just finished weeding the garden when I noticed the envelope. Inside the new blue mailbox, there was no return address. The paper was thick, cream-colored, folded crisply. My name was written in careful, familiar print, smaller than I remembered. Like whoever wrote it wasn't sure they still had the right. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I carried it inside and placed it on the small table beside the kitchen window. I made tea, changed into my soft cotton robe, swept the kitchen floor even though it didn't need sweeping. Sometimes, even after all this time, I still need to prepare myself for softness. When I finally opened it, my hands were steady. Inside was a single page. The handwriting was unmistakable. My son's careful. K, like he always wrote when he was trying to make sure I'd understand him. He didn't begin with "Dear Mom." K didn't apologize in so many words. He said he had read my letter again. Said it took him time to really hear it. Said he hadn't known how far gone he was in the story he'd built. The one where taking over meant love, where control was safety, where my silence was consent. He said he missed me, said he didn't expect anything, not a call, not forgiveness, not even a reply. Just that he hoped I'd found something better than what he gave. That he was starting to understand what I had carried and what he had let fall. He ended it with a line I didn't expect. I see you now. I don't know if it matters, but I do. I folded the letter and placed it inside the same drawer where I'd once kept the unsent one. I didn't cry. I didn't call. Didn't feel that old compulsion to reach back across the line I had drawn. But I felt something soften, not toward him, not right away, but inside myself. Because it does matter, even when it comes late. Being seen, being named truthfully. Being acknowledged not as broken or burdened, but as whole. Still, I didn't move. To reopen that door, I had learned how to live with it closed, and I wasn't going to swing it wide just because he'd knocked. Gently this time, but I let the light in. That evening, I walked down to the sycamore grove beyond the cottage. Air was thick with that quiet gold of approaching dusk. I stood barefoot in the tall grass, letting it brush against my ankles like the world was reminding me I was still part of it. There's a kind of joy that doesn't look like joy. It looks like standing still and feeling nothing pulling at you. No weight on the back of your ribs. No expectations running down the hall behind you. Just breath. Just presence. I sat beneath the largest tree and closed my eyes. It was never about revenge, was never about punishment. It was about coming home. To myself and learning slowly that peace can live in the same room where heartbreak once slept. I stayed out there until the stars blinked on, one by one. And then, as the wind rustled through the trees, I whispered aloud the words I hadn't dared say since the day I walked out of their house. I did the right thing. I needed to say it, not because I doubted, but because some truths need to be spoken with breath, with voice. So they settle into the marrow and stay. I did the right thing when I chose myself. I did the right thing when I left quietly. I did the right thing when I stopped, waiting for their version of love to come back wearing the right clothes. The right thing doesn't always feel like comfort. Sometimes it feels like walking barefoot through sharp gravel. But eventually, you reach the soft moss again. And you remember who you were before the silence swallowed you. Back inside, I lit one candle, the same one I'd lit the first night. In the RV, the night I had promised myself I wouldn't disappear again. I placed it beside the photograph on the mantel, the one where I am standing beside Meredith, eyes open to something new. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the window. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the sound of the chimes into the room. I watched the flicker of the flame. I thought of all the women I've met along the way. Some in real life, some in memory, some in the pages of stories I read late into the night. Women who stayed too long, women who left in silence. Women who found their voice after everyone else had stopped listening. We don't talk about them enough. We don't tell their stories with reverence. But I've come to believe we must, because they are the ones who teach us how to begin again, not in flames, not in grand exits, but in the quiet, persistent decision to choose ourselves over and over and over again. And so I sat, with the letter folded away, the tea cooling, in my hand, and the world spinning quietly on. I didn't know if he would write again, and I didn't know if I would ever write back. But I knew this. I no longer needed to be understood by anyone to live in truth. I no longer waited for recognition, to feel real. And I no longer believed that love meant staying when staying cost you your name. I was not gone. I was not bitter. I was not waiting. I was still, and that was more than enough. Some days I wake before the sun. I don't set an alarm. My body simply knows. The light hasn't broken through the curtains yet, but there's a quiet blue in the sky, like the world is holding its breath. I rise, wrap a shawl around my shoulders, and step outside barefoot. The porch is cool underfoot. The wood holds the memory of nighttime. The air smells like mint and earth and something older than worry. I sit on the top step with a blanket and a cup of water, and I just listen to the wind brushing the leaves, to the distant murmur of a waking bird, to the hush of everything I used to ignore. It's in these early hours that I feel the full weight of freedom, not the kind that rushes, but the kind that rests. I no longer count how many days I've been gone. I no longer flinch when I see a message that looks familiar. I no longer reread the letter he sent me that afternoon in the blue envelope. I haven't burned it. I haven't enshrined it. It lives quietly in a drawer, the way all things should. Once they've said what they came to say, and still my life expands. The garden grew wild this summer. The rosemary refused to stay in its neat little box. Lavender stretched into the walkway. I let it. I stopped pruning things that needed space, including myself. Children pass by the cottage some afternoons, kicking pebbles, dragging sticks. Along the fence, sometimes they wave. Sometimes they're too busy pretending to be knights or detectives or heroes in their own dusty stories. I love watching them. I don't call out. I don't interrupt. I let them be free the way I'm learning to be uninterrupted, uncorrected, whole in their imaginations. Ruth comes by once a week with stories and scones. We sit on the porch and watch the sun melt into the trees. She tells me about her nephews, about the odd man at the post office, about the deer that wandered into her yard. I tell her about the stars I saw last night and the dream I had where my younger self sat across from me and asked if we were okay now. I told her yes, we are. Sometimes I still speak to the version of me that stayed too long. I no longer scold her. I no longer ask why. I thank her for enduring, for loving, for trusting, even when it cost her too much. And then I thank the version who stood up. It's the one who packed her silence into a suitcase and walked out the front door with her, head high. The one who chose to rebuild, not from spite, but from sacred self-respect. I see her every morning now in the mirror. In the garden, in the stillness of my breath, when no one else is watching. And I've learned to live with what remains. Grief doesn't vanish, it settles. Disappointment doesn't dissolve, it dulls. But joy, when it finally arrives, doesn't need to shout. It sits beside you on the porch with the wind in its lap and says, "You're safe now. There are still things I don't understand. Why love turns so easily into possession. Why people take and call it caretaking. Why sons forget the softness of the hands that once fed them. But those are questions I no longer demand answers for. They are clouds, and I've learned to watch them drift without chasing. I've made my peace, one shelf at a time, one pot of soup at a time, one step outside into the evening hush at a time. I am not a story someone else gets to finish. I'm not a lesson. I am not a warning or a regret. I am a life still turning, still blooming, still worthy. Last week, I stood on the porch with a bowl of seeds, sunflower, marigold, wild thyme, scattered them across the garden with no plan. It's just the simple belief that something will grow even when it's not arranged, even when it's left to its own wildness. That's what I am now, a patch of something untamed, something unburdened, something beautiful, not despite what it survived, but because of it. And if he ever stands at my door again, I'll meet him not with bitterness, not with open arms, but with stillness. I'll let him speak. I'll listen. But I won't forget. I don't need him to undo what's been done. I've already done that myself. He asked me once, "Why are you still here?" And I answered at closing. Not with rage, not with accusation, but with truth. I was still there because I had forgotten the sound of my own name. I was still there because I thought sacrifice was the cost of love. I was still there because one told me I could leave and still belong to myself. But now, I'm here not in his house, not in their version of who I was, but in this quiet, beautiful life I've stitched together with steady hands. I didn't run, I rose. I didn't vanish, I returned. I didn't punish, I protected, and now I live. Softly, truthfully, without apology. The wind chimes ring, the rosemary blooms, and the sky folds itself into twilight. And I go inside, light a candle, and sit down to write one last line in my notebook. I saved myself in silence, and now the silence is mine. Now I'm curious about you. Have you ever experienced something like this? Let me know in the comments. And if you stayed with me until now, thank you. I'll leave you with 2 other stories I think you'll love.